The call came on a Wednesday morning while I was still in my housecoat, standing at the kitchen window watching the St. Lawrence fog lift off the water. 43 years I'd lived in that house in Point Claire, and the river still surprised me some mornings. My coffee was getting cold. The phone buzzed on the counter, unknown number, Montreal area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Mr. Ashford. A woman's voice. Careful, deliberate, the kind of voice that's rehearsed what it wants to say. This is Gwendolyn Marsh. I photographed your son's wedding in September. I need to speak with you in person, today if possible. Please don't mention this call to your son or his wife. I set down my mug. The fog was still lifting. A tanker moved slow and quiet out on the river. What's this about? I said. I can't explain over the phone, but I found something in the photographs, Mr. Ashford, something I believe you need to see. Before I could respond, I heard my son-in-law's voice from the living room. My living room, barking at someone on his own phone. Something about a deal that hadn't closed, someone who'd let him down. He'd been staying here with my daughter for 3 months. Temporarily, they'd said, just until the new place was ready, the new place that kept not being ready. What time? I said into the phone. 11. My studio's on Notre Dame West, in St. Henri. I'll text you the address. She paused. I'm sorry to do this, Mr. Ashford. I genuinely am. She hung up. I stood at the window a moment longer. Behind me, my son-in-law's voice filled the house like he'd built it himself. My name is Arthur Ashford. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years building a plumbing supply company in the West Island. 3 warehouses, 11 full-time employees, contracts with half the commercial developers in Greater Montreal. After my wife, Miriam, passed 6 years ago, I kept the business running because it was the only thing that still made sense to me. My children were grown. The house was too quiet. The work gave me a reason to get up before dawn. My son, Colin, married Vanessa Bellamy last September. I paid for the wedding, $48,000. The venue at the Ritz-Carlton, the flowers, the caterer, the open bar that went until 2 in the morning, $48,000, because Colin was my only son. Because I'd missed so many of his school plays and hockey games and graduation dinners while I was building that company. And I wanted just once to give him something without conditions, without keeping something without conditions, without keeping score. It was the most expensive mistake of my life, and I didn't know it yet. Gwendolyn's studio was in a converted row house on Notre Dame, the kind of St. Henri block that's half renovated, half hanging on. Her name was on a small brass plate. Inside, it smelled like darkroom chemicals and espresso. Wedding portraits on the walls. Families, children, the ordinary beautiful moments people pay to have preserved. She met me at the door, younger than I'd expected, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, eyes that had clearly not slept well. She locked the door behind me. Thank you for coming, she said. Can I get you anything? Just show me. She nodded and led me to a back room with a large monitor, wedding albums on shelves, technical equipment I didn't understand, morning light through a small frosted window. Mr. Ashford, I want you to know I went back and forth on this for weeks. It's not my place, and I know that. But I kept asking myself, if someone had this information about my family, would I want to know? She sat at the desk. I stood behind her. The answer was yes. Every time. The answer was yes. Every time. She opened a folder on her monitor. Standard wedding photographs. First, the ceremony at the Ritz Ballroom, Colin and Vanessa at the altar, my face in the crowd, older and grayer than I ever felt on the inside. Then she clicked to a different folder. These were taken 3 hours before the ceremony, she said. I arrived early to do light testing and setup in the anteroom. I was shooting through the glass panel in the door, adjusting my exposure settings. She paused. I didn't realize what I was capturing until I processed the files 2 weeks later. The image that appeared on the screen stopped my breathing. Colin, my son in his rented tuxedo, not yet fully buttoned, with a woman I'd never seen before. Auburn hair, red dress. Not a friendly conversation, not a nervous hug between old friends. The kind of closeness that has its own vocabulary, that needs no explanation. His hand at her waist, her face tilted up toward his. How long before the ceremony? I heard myself ask. 3 hours and 12 minutes. The metadata is here, timestamp, GPS coordinates. The Ritz-Carlton, place to Canada entrance, all verifiable. She scrolled through several more images, different angles. The same two people. In one of them, the woman's left hand was visible against Colin's chest. Gold band. Diamond solitaire. She's wearing a wedding ring, I said. Yes. Not for my son's wedding. No. She wasn't on the guest list, I checked. I straightened. The room felt smaller than it had 2 minutes ago. Is there more? Gwendolyn opened another window on her screen. Technical metadata. File names, timestamps, embedded location data. She printed 2 pages and handed them to me. Everything is documented. I made copies on a drive for you. She opened her desk drawer and set a small USB drive in front of me. I don't know what you'll do with this, but it's yours. I picked up the drive. You did the right thing, I said. Don't apologize for it. The drive home along the 20 felt like driving through someone else's life. My hands were steady on the wheel. My mind was somewhere else entirely. Colin, my son, 41 years old. The boy I'd coached in minor hockey in Vaudreuil. The one who'd sat in the workshop with me on Saturday mornings learning to solder pipe joints, who'd cried at his mother's funeral harder than anyone in the room, 3 hours before his wedding in his rented tuxedo with a woman wearing another man's ring. Why get married at all? That question circled and circled. Why the Ritz? Why the $48,000? Why stand at that altar and say those vows? I pulled into my garage and sat in the car for a long moment. Through the door to the house, I could hear the television. My television. My daughter Heather had taken over the living room with her husband, Troy, and their collective inability to contribute anything to the household except noise and empty wine bottles. I opened the door. Troy was in my recliner. He'd moved it 3 feet closer to the TV without asking. Heather was on the couch, half watching something on her phone, half watching whatever Troy had on. Dad, she didn't look up. Can you pick up Thai food tonight? Troy's too tired and I've got that call at 4. We'll figure out dinner later, I said. It's not a big ask, Dad. I walked past her to my office and closed the door. That night, after Troy had eaten the food I'd picked up and left the containers on the counter, after Heather had gone to bed early citing a headache, I sat at my desk with the USB drive and my laptop. I pulled up the wedding budget spreadsheet, $48,000. Venue, catering, open bar, flowers, the photographer, Gwendolyn, the string quartet for the cocktail hour, the cake from that bakery in Westmount. Then I opened another file, the gift log. Vanessa had managed the gift table herself. No registry, she'd insisted. We have everything we need, Arthur. Cash is just more practical at our age. I'd thought it was sensible. Colin was 41. Vanessa was 38. They didn't need a set of dishes. The total in the gift log was $62,000. My business partner, George Nakamura, had handed Colin a check at the reception, $20,000, firm handshake, the kind of generosity that comes from 30 years of friendship between our families. My own brother had driven in from Kingston with a check for $8,000. 200 guests, people who'd known Colin since he was in Pee Wee hockey. $62,000 in cash and checks, collected by Vanessa personally. I stared at those numbers for a long time. I grabbed a legal pad and started writing. The timeline, the amounts, what I'd observed since the wedding. Because there were things I'd been telling myself were normal were nothing. That didn't look like nothing anymore. 6 weeks after the wedding, Vanessa had called me about a property in Westmount. We found something perfect, Arthur. But the market's moving fast. We'd need help with a deposit, maybe $80,000. You understand, you've always been so supportive of Colin's goals. $80,000, said gently, warmly, as though I'd already agreed. I'd told her I'd think about it. The week before that call, I'd come home to find Heather and Troy in the kitchen with Vanessa on speakerphone. They'd gone quiet when I walked in. Changed the subject too quickly. I wrote that down too. At 2 in the morning, I made myself a tea and stood at the kitchen window. The December cold pressed against the glass. Point Claire in winter. The river gray and still, the old stone houses along the lake shore holding whatever they'd always held. Something had happened in his family while I wasn't looking, or while I was looking and choosing not to see. 7 in the morning, I called a lawyer. I'd met Neil Ashby 15 years ago when I was restructuring the business. He'd moved from corporate law to estate and family law after his own divorce, and he was, without question, the most methodical person I'd ever dealt with in a professional context. His office was in a building on McGill College, 22nd floor, the kind of view that cost $600 an hour. "Tell me everything," he said, legal pad in front of him. From the beginning, I told him. The photographer's call, the images, the gift money, the Westmount property request, the overheard phone call I hadn't mentioned yet because I'd heard it the same day I'd called Neil. Heather's voice from the upstairs hallway, phone against her ear, not knowing I'd come home early. "He's starting to ask questions," Heather had said. "I could tell from his face when he got home. Just keep him focused on the Westmount thing. Once he commits to that deposit, he's in for a penny, in for a pound. You know how he is? He doesn't like to admit he made a mistake." And then Vanessa's voice through the speaker. "The deposit's just the beginning. Once we're in that house and I file, I get half of everything acquired during the marriage. That includes his business shares if we structure it right. Get Troy to find out what he's listed the company at for insurance purposes." I'd written it down, word for word, standing in my front hallway with my coat still on. Neil's pen didn't stop moving the whole time I spoke. "The filing she references," he said when I finished. "She's planning to divorce your son. Within months, I believe. She wants half the marital assets, which she's trying to inflate before she files. And your daughter's involvement? Active, not coerced. They're coordinating." Neil leaned back. "The gift money, $62,000, is marital property in Quebec. If your daughter-in-law files for divorce, she's entitled to a portion of that under the family patrimony rules, regardless of source. That's assuming the marriage was entered in good faith." It wasn't. That changes things. If you have evidence, the photographs, the metadata, documentation that the marriage was fraudulent from inception, there are remedies, but those are for your son to pursue if he chooses to. Neil looked at me directly. "What I can address is your own exposure, your house, your business, your estate. That's why I'm here. In Quebec, estate planning runs through the notarial system." Neil connected me with a notary on Peel Street, a quiet woman named Sylvie Tremblay who'd been drawing up wills and family trusts for 30 years. Together, Neil and Sylvie mapped out a structure, a family trust with a professional trustee, my business interests transferred, my property protected. In Quebec, forced heirship rules mean you can't entirely disinherit children, but you can structure assets, so the mandatory minimum is exactly that. The minimum. I also asked Neil about the other matter. "Heather and Troy," I said. 3 months in my house. No agreement, no rent, no end date. Have you asked them to leave?" "Not formally. In Quebec, without a lease, they're considered occupants. The process is through the Tribunal Administratif du Logement. But given the circumstances, your ownership of the property, no rental history, no agreement, the timeline is shorter than people expect. You can serve a formal notice to vacate. If they refuse, enforcement follows." Something in my chest loosened just slightly. "How soon can we start?" Neil almost smiled. "Today." The formal notice arrived by courier 3 days later. I set the envelopes on the kitchen counter while Heather and Troy were eating lunch, sandwiches they made from groceries I'd bought. Troy opened his first, read the header, set it down. "What is this?" His voice was quiet, dangerous quiet. "You have 30 days to find other accommodation." Heather looked up from her phone. "Dad, what did you do?" "I asked you to leave. Formally this time." Troy stood. He was a big man, Troy. Used to using his size in a room. "You can't be serious. We're family. You've been here 3 months without contributing $1. You've treated my house like a hotel, and my grocery account like a company expense. 30 days. Everyone will know about this. Troy stepped closer. What kind of man throws out his own daughter? The kind who's done being taken advantage of. Step back, please. He didn't for about 10 seconds. Then he did. Heather was crying, the right kind of tears for the performance, arriving on schedule. Dad, we can work something out. We'll pay rent. Will. The notice is legal. I suggest you start looking. I walked to my office, closed the door, locked it. Behind me, the voices rose and fell. Troy's fury, Heather's tears, the scrape of chairs, the particular sound a family makes when it's pretending to fall apart. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. Email from Neil, sent an hour ago. Trust documents ready for review. Notary appointment Thursday at 2. I typed back, I'll be there. That night, Heather called Colin. I heard her on the stairs, voice low and urgent. He served us papers. I don't know what happened. Something changed. Then bring Vanessa. Tomorrow. Don't wait. They arrived at 7 the following evening. Colin and Vanessa together, a bottle of Chateau Frontenac in Vanessa's hands, that warm smile she'd been wearing at family dinners for 2 years. Colin hugged me at the door, firm, practiced. We thought we'd make dinner, Vanessa said, already moving toward my kitchen. You work too hard, Arthur. They cooked pasta, set the table properly. Heather came down, face composed, Troy following behind her with an expression of forced calm. The 5 of us sat down to eat like a family. I watched them. Colin talked about work. Vanessa asked about the business. Troy laughed too loudly at something Colin said. Heather watched me the way you watch a door you're not sure is locked. Then Vanessa set down her fork. Arthur, this situation with Heather and Troy is hard on everyone. It's clearly causing stress. We've been thinking, the house is too much for one person. The upkeep, the taxes on a property this size. Have you thought about simplifying? A nice condo somewhere, Point Claire, or maybe NDG. You'd have everything you need without the burden. And whatever came from the sale, it would be lovely to see that support everyone. There it was, the pivot, the thing they'd come for. Colin nodded. The market in the West Island is strong right now, Dad. You get a great price. We could help you with the whole process. Heather reached for my hand. We just want what's best for you. I looked at each of them and turned. My son, my daughter-in-law, my daughter, her husband. 4 people who had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was a resource to be managed rather than a person to be known. I have something to show you, I said. I went to my office, came back with a folder, set it on the table between the dinner plates. Gwendolyn Marsh called me 3 weeks ago, I said. She photographed Colin's wedding. She had some photographs I hadn't seen. I looked at my son. From 3 hours before the ceremony. The color left Vanessa's face first. Colin opened the folder slowly. He looked at the first photograph for a long time. Then the second. Then he looked up at his wife. I also overheard a conversation, I said. Heather, you were on the phone in the upstairs hallway 2 weeks ago. Vanessa was on speaker. You said, once he commits to that deposit, he's in for a penny, in for a pound. Vanessa said, once I file, I get half of everything acquired during the marriage. No one spoke. I've already met with a lawyer and a notary. My estate is restructured. The house and the business are in a trust. You'll receive what Quebec law requires, nothing more. Vanessa stood abruptly. You can't do this, we're family. You stopped being family when you started treating me like an asset to be liquidated. I stood, folded my napkin, set it beside my plate. Heather and Troy have 27 days remaining on their notice. This conversation is finished. I walked to my office. Behind me, the table erupted. Vanessa's voice sharp and climbing, Colin's defensive and confused, Heather beginning to cry again, Troy saying something I didn't catch and didn't want to. I closed the door, heard the Mercedes in the driveway 20 minutes later, then Troy's truck, then silence. My phone showed 2 texts from Heather. You've lost your mind, and then, 20 minutes later, I hope you're proud of yourself. I set the phone face down and opened the trust document Sylvie had emailed that afternoon. The remaining days were quiet, in the way a house is quiet when it's waiting for something. Day 4, I found a box of my winter clothes moved to the basement. No explanation. Day 7, Troy blocked my car in the driveway and claimed he'd forgotten. Day 9, Heather called their neighbor, a woman named Bernadette from across the street, to come over for tea, and I watched through the window as she performed her grief with impressive detail. Day 12, they tried a formal written proposal, slid under my office door. Troy's handwriting, a business arrangement. They'd stay, pay $800 a month in exchange for me reconsidering the trust. $800 a month for occupying a 4-bedroom house on the lakeshore in Point Claire. I read it twice, walked to the living room, handed it back. No, I said. Heather's voice softened. She'd been saving this. Dad, I know I've made mistakes. He's not the man I thought he was. I see that now. I was afraid to admit it. But I'm asking for another chance. Just me. I want to be your daughter again. The tears were real. That was the worst part. I believed they might actually be real. If that were true, I said quietly, you wouldn't have come here with a condition attached. You want the house, the trust reversed, things back to the way they were. That's not remorse, Heather. That's negotiation. She left the room without speaking. I heard her on the phone with Colin that evening, making plans, coordinating, the way they always had, the way I'd spent 3 months telling myself I was misreading. 20 days after the notice was served, I met Sylvie at her office on Peel Street for the final signing. The trust was complete. Business interests, property, investment accounts, all transferred into a structure managed by a professional trustee, distributed after my death, according to my instructions. Quebec's forced heirship rules meant Heather and Colin would each receive their minimum statutory share. The rest went to the Miriam Ashford Memorial Fund I'd set up at the Montreal Heart Institute the year after my wife died, and to a trades apprenticeship program I'd been quietly funding for 3 years. Sylvie slid the final pages across her desk. You understand this is irrevocable? Yes. Your children may challenge it. Let them. Given the documentation you've provided, the circumstances, your clear legal capacity, any challenge would be extremely difficult. Courts don't overturn properly executed notarial trusts on a whim. She paused. I've done hundreds of these, Mr. Ashford. Most people hesitate at this stage, the finality of it. My wife used to say, hesitation is just fear wearing a suit. I picked up the pen. Miriam was right about most things. I signed. On the 30th day, Neil met me at the house at 9 in the morning. The sheriff's officer arrived at 9:15. His name was Officer Bellemare, careful, professional, the kind of calm that comes from doing a difficult job with dignity. We knocked. Troy answered in a t-shirt and boxers, face set, already positioning himself in the doorway. Sir, this is a legal eviction order, Officer Bellemare said. The 30-day notice period has elapsed. You're required to vacate the premises immediately. You have 2 hours to collect personal belongings. This is insane, Troy said. She's his daughter. I'm aware, 2 hours, clothing and personal effects only. What followed was controlled chaos. Heather moved through the house grabbing things with the mechanical focus of someone who'd already grieved and arrived at anger. Troy threw bags into his truck with more force than was necessary, occasionally looking at me with an expression I recognized as a last attempt at intimidation. I stood in the doorway of my own home and watched without speaking. At the car, Heather turned. When you're alone and something happens to you, when you fall, when you get sick, don't call me. Her voice was flat. The performance had run its course. You'll regret pushing everyone away. I hope you find something real, I said. I genuinely do. She got in the car. Troy followed in his truck. They disappeared down the street in the December cold, past the old stone houses, toward whatever came next for them. Officer Bellemare handed me the paperwork. They're out. Legally vacated. If they return without your permission, call the station directly. Neil shook my hand in the driveway. Well done, Arthur. It was a gray Montreal morning, clouds sitting low over the river. My breath made small clouds in the air. I stood on my front step for a long time, looking at the street I'd lived on for 43 years. Mine. A week later, I sat across from Colin at a coffee shop in Point Claire Village, near the old town hall. His idea. I'd agreed because I was still his father, and that meant something even if I wasn't sure what anymore. He looked older than I'd remembered. Thinner. He'd moved out of the condo he'd shared with Vanessa. She'd filed 6 weeks after the wedding dinner, exactly when she'd planned to. The divorce proceedings were underway. The gift money was tangled up in legal fees. I didn't know about the plan, Colin said. The scheme with the gifts, I swear to you I didn't know. I looked at my son across the table. But you knew about her. He didn't answer immediately. It wasn't what you think. Colin. A long pause. She said it was over. Before the wedding, I believed her. Did you tell anyone? No. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. That's the part I'm struggling with. Not the affair. People make terrible mistakes. But you stood at that altar, and you knew something was wrong, and you said nothing. To me. To anyone. I know. I spent $48,000 on that day. I know, Dad. We sat with that for a while. Outside the window, the village was quiet in the way small Montreal towns go quiet in February. I'm not cutting you out of my life, I said finally. But things are different now. The trust stands. The estate is structured the way I want it structured. That's not about punishment. It's about the fact that I need to know the things I build are protected. Colin nodded slowly. That's fair. It didn't feel fair. It felt like the conversation I should have had with him 20 years ago, the one about accountability and honesty and what it means to be a man who keeps his word. But we were having it now. Better late than never, and later than it should have been. The drive home, I stopped at the hardware store and picked up a new kitchen faucet I'd been meaning to replace since October. Small job. 20 minutes. The kind of thing that had piled up while the house was occupied by people who expected maintenance to happen around them. I installed it that evening, alone in my kitchen, with the river going dark outside the window and the tools Miriam had given me for our 25th anniversary spread across the counter. Ridiculous gift, she'd said, laughing. Who gives their husband a socket set for an anniversary? I told her it was the most romantic thing she'd ever done. We both laughed. I thought about her while I worked. In March, I got a call from Gwendolyn Marsh. She'd been thinking about me, she said, wondering how things had turned out. We talked for 40 minutes. She was funny, careful with her words, the kind of person who notices things, obviously, and thinks about them longer than most people would. We had coffee the following Thursday at a cafe in Saint-Henri, a block from her studio. She asked questions that were easy to answer and listened to the answers without filling the silence with noise. It wasn't complicated. It was just two people talking honestly. I'd forgotten how rare that was. I still go to the office 3 days a week. The other 2. I'm at the trades program, working with apprentices who are learning to do the work I built a company on. Careful, physical, real work. I've been teaching a small group of them on Thursday afternoons. They call me Mr. No, Ashford, and pay attention, which is more than I can say for some people I've known much longer. Heather called once in March, asking for help with first and last month's rent on a new apartment. I said no, and waited for the anger. But she just said, okay, and hung up. Progress, maybe. Or acceptance. I wasn't sure which, and I'd stopped needing to know. Colin and I have dinner every few weeks. We're building something back, slowly, carefully, the way you fix a foundation rather than just painting over the crack. Some mornings I sit on my back porch with coffee and watch the ice break up on the river. The St. Lawrence moves differently in spring, insistent, purposeful, like it's been waiting all winter to remind you where it's going. Miriam used to love watching it. She said it made her feel like everything was moving towards something, even when it didn't feel that way. I think about that most mornings now. And I think she was right. I keep coming back to one moment. Not the lawyer's office, not the eviction, not the dinner table where everything fell apart. I keep coming back to standing in my front hallway with my coat still on, listening to my daughter's voice through the ceiling, and realizing that the story I'd been telling myself about my family was not the story that was actually happening. That's the thing about being taken advantage of slowly. It doesn't feel like betrayal while it's occurring. It feels like generosity. It feels like love. You write the checks, you open the door, you say yes one more time, and you tell yourself, this is what a good father does. What I understand now is that I was confusing kindness with the absence of judgment. I stopped asking whether what I was giving was actually helping anyone, including myself. Colin made his choices. Vanessa made hers. Heather made hers. And I made mine. For years, I made the choice to look away from things I didn't want to see because seeing them clearly would have required me to act, and acting would have been hard. There's a cost to that kind of willful blindness. I paid it slowly, in small installments, until the bill came due all at once in a photographer's studio in Saint-Henri. What changed everything wasn't anger. Anger I'd had for months without it moving me anywhere useful. What changed things was the decision to be honest with myself about what was actually true, even when the truth was that the people I loved most had been lying to me, and that I'd made it easier for them by not asking harder questions sooner. That took something I hadn't exercised in a long time, a willingness to think clearly instead of comfortably. To look at numbers, timelines, phone calls, and patterns and follow them where they led, instead of stopping at the point where the conclusion became uncomfortable. Neil helped. Sylvie helped. Gwendolyn, most of all, helped. But the thinking was mine to do, and I had to choose to do it. And then, after the thinking, came the harder part, actually following through, signing the documents, serving the notice, sitting at that dinner table and setting the folder down. I won't pretend those moments were easy. There were nights in that period where I sat in my office past midnight wondering whether I was doing the right thing or just doing the cold thing. The difference matters. What I held on to was this. Protecting what you've built is not the same as being cruel. Saying no clearly is not the same as not loving someone. You can grieve a relationship and still refuse to be consumed by it. Gwendolyn asked me once over coffee in Saint-Henri whether I regretted how things had turned out. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I said I regretted the years before, the years of saying yes, when no would have been more honest, more useful, more respectful to everyone involved, including my children. Learning to say no was the thing I should have taught Colin and Heather when they were young. Instead, I taught them that I would always absorb the consequence of their choices. That wasn't love. That was fear dressed up as generosity. What I have now is quieter than what I had, but it's mine, and it's honest. That turns out to matter more than I knew.